Hello and welcome to Fall Asleep To. If you enjoy thoughtful, immersive content like this, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know. And while you're here, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it right now for you? Let me know in the comments. I read everyone. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin our journey into one of the most defining events of the 20th century, the Great Depression. The story of the Great Depression does not begin with a crash. It begins with a celebration. The decade that preceded the Great Depression, the 1920s, was known as the Roaring Twenties, a period of dazzling economic growth, cultural transformation, and technological innovation in the United States. But beneath the glittering surface of this decade, structural cracks were already forming. Cracks that would soon widen into one of the most devastating economic collapses in history. The 1920s were a time of transition. After the horrors of World War I, many Americans were eager to embrace a new era of peace and prosperity. Technological innovations were rapidly changing the way people lived. The widespread adoption of the automobile, made affordable by Henry Ford's assembly line, reshaped cities and redefined personal mobility. Radios brought news, music, and advertising into homes across the country. Skyscrapers climbed into the sky, and jazz filled the airwaves. This decade also saw a boom in consumer spending. For the first time, many Americans were buying products on credit. Installment plans allowed people to purchase radios, washing machines, furniture, and even cars, paying them off over time. The idea of buy now, pay later became a cultural norm. As a result, demand surged, businesses expanded, and stock prices soared. But this prosperity was uneven. While urban centers flourished, rural America struggled. The agricultural sector, which had been heavily relied upon during the war years, faced falling prices and rising debts in the 1920s. Farmers had taken out loans to invest in new equipment and land during the war, expecting high demand for crops to continue. When prices dropped in the post-war years, many were left unable to repay their debts. Meanwhile, the stock market was becoming a national obsession. Wall Street, once the domain of seasoned financiers, was now attracting everyday Americans. Teachers, factory workers, housewives, all hoping to strike it rich. By the late 1920s, the market had taken on a life of its own. Stocks were being bought not based on the actual performance of the companies, but in hopes that they would continue to rise in value. It was a classic speculative bubble, and it was growing fast. Banks played a critical role in this dangerous dance. With limited regulations, they freely lent money for stock purchases. Investors could buy stocks on margin, meaning they only had to pay a small percentage of the stock's value up front, borrowing the rest from their broker. This system worked as long as stock prices kept rising. But if they fell, brokers would demand immediate repayment, forcing investors to sell quickly. And that's when things could unravel very quickly. By 1929, warning signs were becoming hard to ignore. Steel production was declining. Construction had slowed. Consumer debt was at all-time highs. And many stocks were grossly overvalued. Still, the general public, encouraged by a media filled with optimism, continued to invest. Economists and business leaders insisted that the economy was sound. President Herbert Hoover, just months into his presidency, famously declared in early 1929 that the outlook for peace and the prosperity of our people is brighter than ever before. That optimism would soon be shattered. In September 1929, the stock market began to wobble, prices fluctuated, and nervous investors began to sell. On October 24th, known as Black Thursday, panic began to set in. Nearly 13 million shares were traded, an unprecedented volume. Stock values plummeted. Banks and investment houses tried to stabilize the market by buying large blocks of stocks, and for a moment it worked. But the following week, the bottom fell out. On October 29th, 1929, Black Tuesday, the stock market crashed. In a single day, investors lost billions of dollars. Fortunes were erased. Lifelong savings vanished. The confidence that had driven the roaring economy of the 1920s evaporated overnight. But the crash, while dramatic, was not the cause of the Great Depression. Rather, it was the spark that ignited a far larger and deeper crisis. In the months that followed, the full scope of the economic collapse began to unfold. Businesses, facing plummeting demand, began laying off workers. Consumer spending dried up. Factories shuttered. Banks, overextended from risky loans and bad investment, began to fail, wiping out the savings of millions of depositors. Between 1930 and 1933, more than 9,000 banks
closed their doors. Unemployment rose rapidly. By 1933, nearly 25% of the American workforce was without a job, and in some areas, especially among minority communities, the rates were even higher. Bread lines formed in cities across the nation. Soup kitchens tried to meet the needs of the hungry. Families were evicted from their homes and forced into makeshift shanty towns, derisively known as the villas. The pain was not confined to the United States, because the American economy was deeply connected to global markets. The depression quickly spread worldwide. Countries that relied on US loans or exports found themselves cut off. International trade collapsed as countries raised tariffs in a desperate attempt to protect domestic industries. The infamous Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, signed into law by President Hoover, raised tariffs on thousands of imported goods, triggering a wave of retaliatory tariffs from other countries and deepening the global economic crisis. By the early 1930s, it became clear that this was not a normal economic downturn. It was something far more serious. It was a collapse of the systems and assumptions that had defined the modern economy, and it demanded new answers, new policies, and new ways of thinking. As we continue this story, we will explore the specific causes behind the Great Depression, from banking failures to agricultural collapse, from misguided government policies to deep structural weaknesses in the economy. We will hear the voices of those who lived through it, understand how it reshaped American politics, and see how it changed the world forever. To truly understand the Great Depression, we must go beyond the dramatic imagery of Wall Street's crash and look deeper into the economic, structural, and psychological factors that caused such a widespread and enduring collapse. It wasn't just one mistake or one failed institution. It was a perfect storm of systemic vulnerabilities that compounded each other in devastating ways. One of the most significant causes was the fundamental imbalance between production and consumption. The 1920s had seen a rapid expansion of industrial output. Factories were producing goods at unprecedented rates.
Cars, radios, refrigerators, and textiles. However, while production soared, wages for most workers remained stagnant. This meant that the average person could not afford to buy the very products that were flooding the market. To bridge the gap, many turned to credit. Department stores, car dealerships, and banks extended generous lines of credit. This kept the economy buoyant for a time, but it was a fragile model. When people began to lose their jobs or faced pay cuts, they defaulted on their payments. Suddenly, a system that was built on future income collapsed under the weight of present inability. The banking system, a crucial pillar of the economy, was dangerously over-leveraged. Banks had taken deposits from everyday citizens and invested them heavily in the stock market. When the market crashed, banks lost vast amounts of capital. Worse, many people, fearful of losing their savings, rushed to withdraw their money, a phenomenon known as a bank run. Since banks only kept a small portion of deposits on hand, they quickly became insolvent. Another critical factor was the collapse of international trade. In an attempt to protect American industries, Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in 1930. This law raised tariffs on a wide range of imported goods. The intention was to encourage Americans to buy domestic products, but the result was disastrous. Other countries retaliated with their own tariffs, leading to a steep decline in global trade. American exports fell sharply, leading to more layoffs and deepening the crisis. The agricultural sector, long in decline since the end of World War I, was hit especially hard. Farmers had overproduced during the 1920s, trying to make up for falling prices by planting more and harvesting more. This led to a glut of crops and an even steeper drop in prices. Many farmers, already in debt, were unable to make payments on their land and equipment. Foreclosures became common. Families lost not only their homes, but their way of life. At the same time, environmental disaster compounded economic hardship. In the Great Plains, a series of severe droughts in the early 1930s turned fertile farmland into barren dust. Overfarming and poor soil conservation practices left the land vulnerable to wind erosion. What followed became known as the Dust Bowl, massive dust storms that blackened skies, destroyed crops, and drove tens of thousands of families from their land. These Dust Bowl refugees, many of them from Oklahoma, Texas, and Kansas, headed west in search of work and hope, often finding neither. The political response in the early years of the Depression was cautious, even timid. President Herbert Hoover, a man of considerable administrative experience and personal integrity, believed that the downturn was a temporary setback. He encouraged voluntary cooperation among businesses, charities, and local governments, hoping that private initiative would restore prosperity. He opposed direct federal aid to individuals, fearing it would undermine work ethic and personal responsibility. Hoover's policies, while perhaps principled, were largely ineffective against the scale of the crisis. His insistence on maintaining a balanced federal budget limited the government's ability to inject money into the economy. Public works programs were launched, such as the construction of the Hoover Dam. But these were small in scope and slow to take effect. By 1932, the economy had deteriorated to the point that even Hoover acknowledged the need for more direct intervention. But by then, public confidence in his leadership had all but vanished. The social consequences of the Depression were profound. The middle class, once a symbol of American stability, shrank dramatically. Formerly respectable families found themselves destitute, lining up at soup kitchens or begging on street corners. Many men, unable to find work, left their families in search of jobs elsewhere, riding freight trains from town to town. A generation of children grew up undernourished, poorly clothed, and in unstable housing. Schools closed due to lack of funds. Hospitals turned patients away. Suicide rates climbed. Birth rates fell. Hope, once an American birthright, became a scarce commodity. Yet even amid the hardship, stories of resilience and solidarity emerged. Neighbors shared what little they had. Community kitchens, often run by churches or volunteers, fed the hungry. Bartering systems arose in local communities where cash was no longer available. Workers organized strikes and protests, demanding fair treatment and recognition of their rights. Artists, musicians, and writers channeled their pain into works that reflected the spirit of the times. Gritty, real, and unflinching. Politically, the Depression would reshape the nation's landscape. It exposed the weaknesses of laissez-faire capitalism and the dangers of unregulated markets. It made clear that the government could not stand aloof while millions suffered. It set the stage for a dramatic transformation, one that would come with the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1932 and the sweeping reforms he would soon unveil under the banner of the New Deal. But before we dive into that next chapter, let's pause for a moment to reflect. The Great Depression was not just an economic event, it was a deeply human experience. It touched lives in every city, every farm, every family. It challenged the very idea of what it meant to be secure, to be American, to believe in tomorrow. By the end of 1932, the United States was a nation in crisis. 1 out of every 4 Americans was unemployed. Thousands of banks had collapsed. The promise of the American dream had dimmed, and with it, the people's faith in the federal government. Into this darkness stepped a man whose optimism, calm demeanor, and bold vision would reshape the nation. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Franklin D. Roosevelt, or FDR, was elected president in November 1932 by a landslide. He ran on a platform that promised a new deal for the American people, though what that actually meant was still vague
What he offered, more than specific policy, was hope, a belief that the government could and should take action to ease the suffering of its people. Roosevelt was inaugurated on March 4th, 1933. In his first inaugural address, he delivered the now famous line, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." It was a statement meant to break through the psychological paralysis that had gripped the nation, a call to face hardship with resolve and unity. Roosevelt wasted no time. Within his first 100 days in office, a period that would set a new standard for presidential action, he unleashed a wave of legislation unlike anything the country had seen before. This flurry of reforms and programs would come to define the first New Deal. One of his first priorities was to stabilize the banking system. On his second day in office, FDR declared a nationwide bank holiday, closing all banks for several days to prevent further runs. Congress quickly passed the Emergency Banking Relief Act, which allowed only solvent banks to reopen under the supervision of the Treasury. To calm public fears, Roosevelt
delivered the first of his fireside chats, radio broadcasts where he spoke directly to the American people in a warm, reassuring tone. His explanation of the banking crisis helped restore confidence, and when banks reopened, deposits far exceeded withdrawals. Next came the creation of federal agencies designed to address unemployment, restore confidence, and regulate key sectors of the economy. One of the first was the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, a program that put young men to work on environmental projects such as planting trees, building parks, and preventing soil erosion. It provided not only a paycheck, but also a sense of purpose and dignity. Another major initiative was the Public Works Administration, PWA, and later the Works Progress Administration, WPA. These agencies funded the construction of schools, hospitals, roads, bridges, and public buildings across the country. Artists and writers were also employed to create murals, guidebooks, and plays. A recognition that culture and creativity were vital parts of national recovery. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, AAA, aimed to address the crisis in farming. It sought to raise crop prices by paying farmers to reduce production. Though controversial, especially as people were going hungry, it was a first attempt to balance supply and demand in the agricultural sector. In some cases, livestock were slaughtered and crops destroyed to reduce surpluses, a deeply difficult but economically targeted decision. In the industrial sector, the National Industrial Recovery Act, NRA, created the National Recovery Administration, NRA. This agency
set codes of fair practice, minimum wages, and maximum working hours. Businesses that complied could display the Blue Eagle emblem, a sign of patriotic cooperation. However, the NRA faced criticism for favoring large businesses and was later declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. Perhaps one of the most lasting changes of the early New Deal came with the Securities Act of 1933 and the Securities Exchange Act of 1934, which created the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, to regulate the stock market. The wild speculation that had characterized the 1920s was reined in, and new rules sought to restore integrity to financial markets. Another important reform was the Glass-Steagall Act, which separated commercial and investment banking to prevent banks from using depositors' funds for risky investments. It also established the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, which insured bank deposits up to a certain amount, a policy that remains in place today. These programs, taken together, formed the foundation of what became known as the First New Deal. They were experimental, bold, and sometimes contradictory. Roosevelt himself admitted that not all ideas would work, but he believed that the urgency of the moment required action, not perfection. And the American people, for the most part, responded positively. FDR's calm confidence and willingness to try new things inspired a population that had grown disillusioned. Unemployment remained high, but the sense of free fall had ended. The government was now an active participant in the economy, a protector of the public interest, and a source of hope for millions. Yet not everyone was pleased. Critics emerged from all sides. Conservatives argued that the New Deal represented government overreach, stifling business, and violating free market principles. Some business leaders accused Roosevelt of being a traitor to his class. The Supreme Court, as mentioned, struck down key parts of his early legislation.
Citing constitutional concerns. From the left, others argued that Roosevelt hadn't gone far enough. Figures like Huey Long, a populist senator from Louisiana, proposed more radical wealth redistribution under his Share Our Wealth program. Father Charles Coughlin, a Catholic priest with a national radio show, initially supported the New Deal, but later turned against it, accusing Roosevelt of serving Wall Street interests. Roosevelt faced a delicate balancing act. He had to push hard enough to deliver real change, but not so far that he lost the support of moderates or the institutions that held power. It was a new role for the American presidency, one that combined bold policy making with direct communication to the people. Throughout 1933 and 1934, the New Deal continued to evolve. The administration created programs like the Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, which brought electricity, flood control, and economic development to a vast swath of the rural South. This massive infrastructure project not only improved lives, but also showcased what centralized planning and federal investment could accomplish. By the end of Roosevelt's first 2 years in office, the landscape of American government had been fundamentally altered. For the first time, the federal government assumed responsibility for economic stability, social welfare, and job creation. The idea that Washington, D.C. could and should play an active role in the lives of everyday citizens was no longer radical, it was becoming mainstream. But the Depression was not yet over. The economic crisis persisted, and new challenges, both domestic and international, were on the horizon. As Roosevelt prepared for re-election in 1936, he began laying the groundwork for a second New Deal, one that would go even further in reshaping the social contract. By 1935, the initial flurry of Roosevelt's first New Deal had begun to show results. The bleeding had slowed. Banks were more stable. Jobs were returning, slowly, unevenly, but perceptibly. And most importantly, the American people had regained a sense of agency, that something was being done. But Roosevelt knew that the job was far from finished. Despite his overwhelming re-election in 1936, opposition to his policies, both from the right and from the left, was growing louder. Critics pointed out that while programs like the CCC and WPA provided temporary jobs, they didn't address the underlying causes of poverty and insecurity. Labor unrest was rising. Income inequality was still staggering, and many elderly Americans were living in desperate poverty with no pensions or reliable support system. Roosevelt's answer to these challenges came in the form of what historians now call the Second New Deal, a more progressive, more structurally transformative phase of reform that ran from 1935 to 1938. If the first New Deal had been about emergency relief and economic stabilization, the Second New Deal was about justice, fairness, and security. It would lay the foundation for what we now know as the modern American welfare state. The most significant and lasting achievement of the Second New Deal was the Social Security Act of 1935. This act created a national pension system for retired workers aged 65 and older, funded through payroll taxes paid by both employers and employees. For the first time, Americans had a form of financial security in old age, a revolutionary concept
in a country that had historically emphasized individual responsibility over collective guarantees. But Social Security wasn't just about retirement. The Act also established unemployment insurance
for those who had lost their jobs, as well as aid to dependent children and support for the disabled. These programs created a basic safety net, an acknowledgement that in a modern industrial society, some risks, like aging, illness, or job loss, were too great to be borne alone. Still, Social Security had its limitations. It initially excluded agricultural and domestic workers, a decision that disproportionately affected African Americans and women. These exclusions were part of a political compromise to win Southern support in Congress, revealing the racial and gendered inequalities that still shaped federal policy. Another landmark reform of this era was the National Labor Relations Act, also known as the Wagner Act, passed in 1935. This law guaranteed workers the right to unionize, collectively bargain, and engage in strikes. It also created the National Labor Relations Board, NLRB, to oversee labor disputes and ensure fair practices. This was a radical shift. For decades, labor unions had been suppressed, sometimes violently, by business interests and local governments. The Wagner Act gave workers legal backing and the confidence to organize. As a result, union membership surged during the late 1930s. Workers in factories, mines, and railroads began demanding and receiving better wages, safer conditions, and recognition of their collective power. The Second New Deal also sought to redistribute wealth and reduce inequality. Roosevelt introduced the Revenue Act of 1935, often referred to by critics as the soak the rich tax. It raised taxes on high incomes, corporate profits, and large inheritances. The intent wasn't just to raise revenue, but to signal that the burden of recovery should be shared more fairly. Critics cried socialism. Supporters hailed it as long overdue justice. In rural America, the Resettlement Administration and later the Farm Security Administration provided loans to poor farmers, built housing, and promoted soil conservation techniques. These programs aimed not just to provide immediate relief, but to create long-term sustainability in regions ravaged by the Dust Bowl and years of neglect. Culturally, the Second New Deal also supported the arts in unprecedented ways. Under the umbrella of the Works Progress Administration, WPA, the federal project Number 1 funded writers, musicians, visual artists, and actors. Murals were painted in post offices. Oral histories were recorded. Plays were performed in small towns across the country. This was the government saying, in clear, bold terms, that culture mattered. That art was not a luxury, but a mirror to society and a balm in times of hardship. But not everything went smoothly. The new powers of labor unions led to tensions between workers and employers. Strikes erupted in major industries: auto, steel, shipping, some of which turned violent. Business leaders decried what they saw as government interference in the free market. The Supreme Court, meanwhile, remained skeptical of Roosevelt's expanding reach. In 1935, the court struck down the National Industrial Recovery Act, NIRA, as unconstitutional. In 1936, it invalidated parts of the Agricultural Adjustment Act. Roosevelt, frustrated by these roadblocks, proposed a controversial plan to reorganize the Supreme Court, a move widely seen as an attempt to pack the court with justices favorable to his policies. The proposal backfired politically, though the court did eventually shift its stance, with key justices retiring or altering their votes. The episode damaged Roosevelt's credibility and temporarily slowed the momentum of the New Deal. Still, by the end of 1938, Roosevelt's vision had reshaped American government. The federal state was no longer a distant overseer. It was an active participant in everyday life. Social security checks began arriving in the mail. Workers had new rights. Unemployment was lower than it had been in years, though still too high for comfort. The economy had not fully recovered, but it was no longer in free fall. And yet, in the midst of progress, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. Europe was once again teetering on the edge of war. Germany, under Adolf Hitler, had rearmed and annexed Austria. In Asia, Japan had invaded China. The United States, still grappling with its own economic scars, watched warily from across the oceans. As the 1940s dawned, Roosevelt would soon face the most difficult test of all. Not just how to end the Depression, but how to prepare the nation for global conflict. By the late 1930s, the American economy had experienced modest improvements. Federal programs had put millions back to work. Banks were no longer collapsing, and the fear that had gripped the nation at the beginning of the decade had somewhat lifted. But the Great Depression was far from over. In 1937, the fragile recovery suffered a serious setback. Believing that the worst was behind them, Roosevelt's administration made the decision to cut government spending. They scaled back New Deal programs and reduced public works funding in an effort to balance the federal budget, a goal that had long been on Roosevelt's mind. Many economic advisors, echoing classical economic thinking, argued that continued deficit spending would weaken long-term stability. But this retrenchment proved disastrous. Almost immediately, the economy began to contract again. Industrial production fell sharply. Unemployment, which had declined to around 14%, jumped back to nearly 20%. The stock market tumbled. This sudden reversal became known as the Roosevelt recession, a stark reminder that the recovery was not yet self-sustaining. The administration quickly reversed course. Government spending resumed. Public employment projects expanded once more, and confidence began to return. But the experience exposed the limits of the New Deal's ability to produce a full recovery. While the federal government could provide relief and stimulate demand, structural problems, both domestic and global, continue to hold the economy back. At the same time, political winds were shifting. The Supreme Court battles of 1937 had tarnished Roosevelt's reputation among some moderates. Conservative forces, both in Congress and in business circles, mounted stronger opposition to further reforms. The momentum that had carried the New Deal forward during the early 1930s had slowed. America was entering a new phase, one marked more by consolidation and cautious administration than sweeping legislative transformation. Despite these challenges, the social impact of the New Deal endured. By 1939, Social Security payments were becoming a fixture in American life. Unemployment insurance was embedded in the state systems. Labor unions had a legal foothold. Thousands of schools, roads, bridges, airports, and public buildings had been constructed, many of which would serve generations to come. The federal government's role had been permanently expanded. Where once it was a distant overseer, it was now a source of direct support and regulation in everyday life. Americans, while still valuing self-reliance, increasingly expected their government to provide a safety net and intervene in times of crisis. Beyond the economics and politics, life during the Depression shaped the character of a generation. People learned to live with less. Frugality became a virtue. Homemade repairs, mended clothes, and shared meals were part of daily survival. Entertainment was simple but vital. Radios connected households to the outside world, delivering not just news and Roosevelt's fireside chats, but also dramas, comedies, and music that lifted spirits. Literature and art from the period reflected both the pain and the resilience of the times. Writers like John Steinbeck captured the struggles of displaced farmers in The Grapes of Wrath. Dorothea Lange's haunting photographs documented the faces of poverty and migration. These cultural records became as much a part of the era's legacy as its economic statistics. In the fields of the Midwest, families packed their belongings onto trucks and left behind dust-choked farms in search of work. Many headed to California, hoping to find seasonal labor in the fields. Their journeys were often harsh and their hopes sometimes dashed. but they carried with them the tenacity and quiet dignity that would become a hallmark of the Depression era. Cities, too, felt the strain. In urban centers, men lined up for day labor jobs. Women stretched limited household budgets to feed families. Children went to school hungry. Social workers, churches, and local charities struggled to meet the overwhelming need. And yet, out of this hardship, communities often found ways to pull together, sharing food, pooling resources, and looking after one another. For African Americans, Latinos, and other marginalized groups, the Depression brought compounded hardship. Discrimination in hiring was widespread. New Deal programs often excluded or marginalized people of color, either through official policy or local implementation. Lynchings, segregation, and voter suppression continued, especially in the South. Despite this, Black workers and activists increasingly demanded inclusion and equality, laying groundwork for the civil rights struggles to come. Indigenous communities, long neglected and oppressed by federal policy, saw some attention through the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, which aimed to reverse decades of forced assimilation and restore tribal governance. While imperfect in its execution, the act marked a shift toward acknowledging Native American sovereignty. The Great Depression was not a uniform experience. It varied by geography, race, class, gender, and occupation. But one common thread connected nearly all Americans during this time: a sense of uncertainty. Whether one lived in a tenement in Chicago, a farm in Oklahoma, or a migrant camp in California, the future seemed unknowable. The rules had changed. The old systems had failed, and no one could say for sure what would come next. Yet even in the darkest years, Americans found ways to adapt. Soup kitchens kept the hungry fed. New Deal theater troupes performed plays in remote towns. Union halls buzzed with organizing efforts. Neighbors became lifelines. Families relied on each other. Through improvisation, stubbornness, and sheer will, millions endured. The Depression, for all its economic devastation, did not break the country. Instead, it reshaped it, economically, politically, and culturally. It taught hard lessons about inequality, risk, and the consequences of neglecting the most vulnerable. And as the decade closed, with tensions rising in Europe and Asia, America stood at the edge of a new global reality. The long economic struggle had left its mark, but the next chapter would demand even
more. In the final years of the 1930s, the Great Depression remained a constant reality for millions of Americans. Although Roosevelt's New Deal had softened the worst of the suffering, unemployment still hovered around 15%, and the economy had not returned to its pre-crash levels. The promise of recovery was still elusive. Then in 1939, a new force began to shift the course of history. Not a government program, but a war. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. World War II had begun. At first, the United States remained neutral, guided by laws that reflected widespread isolationist sentiment. The wounds of World War I were still fresh. Many Americans, still focused on domestic recovery, wanted no part in another overseas conflict. But the war quickly reshaped the global economic order, and with it, the fate of the American economy. The belligerent nations needed weapons, vehicles, fuel, food, and raw materials. Factories across Europe had been repurposed for war or destroyed. The United States, still rich in natural resources and industrial capacity, became the arsenal of democracy, even before formally entering the war. In 1940, Roosevelt persuaded Congress to approve the Lend-Lease Act, which allowed the US to supply Allied nations with raw material while maintaining official neutrality. Britain and later the Soviet Union received tanks, planes, ammunition, and food, all manufactured in American factories. This production surge breathed new life into the economy. Idle factories roared back to life. New plants were constructed. Unemployed workers were hired, trained, and put back to work. Shipyards on the coasts, steel mills in Pittsburgh, auto plants in Detroit, all began running around the clock to meet the explosive demand. Women, many of whom had been pushed out of the workforce during the Depression, were now called upon to fill the labor gap. Rosie the Riveter became a cultural icon, symbolizing the transformation of gender roles and labor during wartime. The war effort also reached into every American town. Scrap drives collected metal, rubber, and other materials for reuse. Rationing of meat, sugar, gasoline, and other essentials became part of daily life. War bonds were sold to finance the military buildup, turning citizens into direct investors in national defense. In 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor changed everything. With the United States formally entering the war, the economy shifted into overdrive. The Depression, which had lingered for more than a decade, was over, not through social programs or market corrections, but through the demands of total war. The statistics tell the story clearly. Between 1940 and 1944, unemployment dropped from 14% to under 2%. Gross domestic product soared. Industrial production doubled. Entire new sectors, aviation, synthetic materials, electronics, were born or dramatically expanded. The federal budget, once carefully constrained, exploded in size. The government became the dominant economic force in American life. But the effects were not only economic. The war created new patterns of migration and social change. Millions of Americans moved to cities, to coasts, to defense jobs. African Americans, still subject to Jim Crow laws in the South, moved north and west in record numbers in what became known as the Second Great Migration. They sought opportunity in booming war industries, but often encountered discrimination in housing, jobs, and pay. Latinos were recruited for agricultural labor under the Bracero program, which
brought hundreds of thousands of Mexican workers into the US to fill wartime labor shortages, a policy that would have long-term consequences for immigration and labor history. Native Americans served in the military and worked in factories at higher rates per capita than any other group, contributing significantly to the war effort and sparking new debates about civil rights. Japanese Americans, however, experienced one of the darkest chapters of this era. Following Pearl Harbor, over 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 of whom were US citizens, were forcibly removed from their homes and placed in internment camps under Executive Order 9066. These camps, often in remote desert areas, symbolized a profound violation of civil liberties driven by fear, racism, and wartime hysteria. As factories flourished and jobs multiplied, inequality persisted. Black and brown workers were often given the most dangerous or least desirable jobs. Wages, though improved, were still unequal. Housing shortages led to overcrowded slums, and race riots erupted in several cities as social tensions rose. Nonetheless, the war offered a form of economic empowerment that had been unimaginable just a few years earlier. Families paid off debts. Home ownership rates increased. Savings accounts grew. For many working-class Americans, the 1940s offered their first taste of financial security. War, with all its horror, had succeeded where peace had failed. In 1944, with victory on the horizon, Roosevelt signed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, commonly known as the GI Bill. This law provided returning veterans with access to education, low-interest home loans, and unemployment assistance. It would play a critical role in shaping post-war America, expanding the middle class, encouraging college attendance and fueling suburban growth. The Great Depression ended not with a triumphant flourish, but with a hard pivot into a new global order. The rise of the military-industrial complex, the reshaping of social norms, and the expansion of federal power had changed the country irrevocably. But those who had lived through the Depression, who had stood in breadlines, searched for work and watched neighbors lose homes and hope, carried its lessons with them. They emerged from the ordeal scarred but not defeated, stronger in some ways, wiser in others. The suffering of the 1930s had taught them that prosperity was fragile, that systems could fail, that government, for all its flaws, could also be a force for good, that resilience and community mattered, that dignity could survive hardship. Even as victory parades filled the streets in 1945, the memory of the Depression remained close, a shadow that shaped how a generation would raise children, spend money, view politics, and define fairness. It lingered in their thrift, in their caution, in their expectations. Because history doesn't end, it echoes. Though the Great Depression is most often associated with the United States, its effects were deeply global. The economic devastation that began in America in 1929 quickly rippled across continents, reshaping economies, destabilizing governments, and fueling the rise of authoritarianism in ways that would soon engulf the entire world in conflict. In the early 20th century, the United States had become a central node in the global financial system. After World War I, the US emerged as the world's largest creditor. European nations, especially those devastated by the war, relied heavily on American loans to rebuild their economies and stabilize their currencies. When Wall Street crashed in 1929 and US lending dried up, it pulled the rug out from under the entire international financial order. Germany was among the hardest hit. Under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, it owed enormous reparations to the Allied powers. These payments were being made possible in large part through loans from American banks. When those loans stopped, Germany's fragile economy collapsed. Banks failed, unemployment soared, and inflation, which had already wreaked havoc in the early 1920s, returned in a different form. The Weimar Republic, already viewed with suspicion and resentment by many Germans, lost what little trust it had left. Extremist parties on both the far left and far right began to attract support by offering radical solutions to the crisis. Among them was Adolf Hitler's National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party. The Depression didn't create fascism in Germany, but it supercharged it. Hitler exploited the chaos and despair, blaming Germany's woes on Jews, communists, and the unfair Versailles Treaty. His message resonated with a population desperate for stability, employment, and national pride. By 1933, he was Chancellor, and the groundwork for dictatorship had been laid. Italy experienced a similar trend. Benito Mussolini had already come to power in the 1920s, but the Depression deepened Italy's economic malaise and justified further authoritarian consolidation. The fascist state, like Nazi Germany, emphasized national unity, military strength, and the suppression of dissent. In the United Kingdom, the Depression led to widespread unemployment, especially in industrial areas like Northern England, Scotland, and Wales. To address budget shortfalls, the British government cut public spending and unemployment benefits, a policy that deepened social unrest. The 1930s saw hunger marches, protest movements, and a surge in support for both socialist and fascist movements, though Britain's political system ultimately remained intact. France suffered as well. Weakened by war debts and political fragmentation, it entered the Depression with a less flexible economy. By the mid-1930s, a left-wing coalition known as the Popular Front rose to power, instituting labour reforms such as the 40-hour work week and paid vacations. These gains, however, were short-lived and faced fierce opposition from conservatives and business leaders. In the Soviet Union, the effects of the global depression were indirect, but no less significant. The USSR, under Joseph Stalin, had isolated itself from capitalist economies and was in the midst of forced industrialization and collectivization. While the Soviet system avoided the kind of financial collapse seen elsewhere, it endured massive internal crises, including famine, purges, and political terror, largely hidden from the outside world. Nonetheless, the apparent stability of the Soviet economy during the capitalist world's collapse provided propaganda fodder for communist movements around the globe. In Latin America, nations dependent on exports such as coffee, sugar, and minerals suffered deeply as global demand evaporated. Countries like Brazil, Chile, and Argentina faced economic contraction, rising unemployment, and political instability. Some governments veered toward authoritarianism. Others experimented with state-led development strategies in an effort to break dependency on volatile global markets. Canada, deeply tied to both British and American markets, endured its own version of the crisis. Unemployment soared, especially in the western provinces. Dust Bowl conditions spread across the Canadian prairies, displacing farmers and devastating agriculture. Relief camps were set up for the unemployed, and protests erupted. Most famously, the On to Ottawa Trek in 1935, a cross-country march by jobless men that ended in a violent confrontation with police in Regina. In Asia, the Depression further destabilized an already fragile international order. Japan, heavily reliant on exports such as silk, saw prices collapse. This economic shock weakened the democratic elements within the Japanese government and strengthened the military factions advocating for imperial expansion. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, marking the beginning of its aggressive expansion across East Asia, a campaign that would ultimately draw the United States into war. China, already fragmented by warlordism and civil war, was too weak to resist Japan's expansion. The ensuing conflict would lead to the brutal Second Sino-Japanese War, beginning in 1937. The suffering inflicted on Chinese civilians during this period, including events like the Nanjing Massacre, was among the most horrific of the entire 20th century. The Depression didn't just disrupt economies, it eroded faith in democratic institutions. Around the world, people looked at the failures of liberal democracy and capitalism and questioned whether those systems could provide security and stability. In many places, the answer seemed to be no. Authoritarianism rose not simply because of ideology, but because of desperation. Populations overwhelmed by joblessness, hunger, and uncertainty were willing to surrender freedoms for the promise of order. Leaders who offered scapegoats, simple answers, and national revival gained power with alarming speed. The result was a decade not only of economic struggle, but of geopolitical transformation. The Depression created conditions that allowed World War II to happen. It turned regional grievances into global ideologies. It gave rise to leaders who would plunge the world into conflict and genocide. Even in nations that resisted dictatorship, the lessons of the Depression left a lasting imprint. Central banks began to take a more active role in managing economies. The gold standard, a rigid monetary system blamed for worsening the downturn, was abandoned in many countries. Ideas about social safety nets, government intervention, and economic planning gained mainstream acceptance. The world had changed, and even when prosperity eventually returned, it would return to a world shaped and scarred by the collapse that began in 1929. While the Great Depression is often told through statistics, unemployment rates, bank failures, GDP contractions, its true legacy is just as much cultural as it is economic. In the 1930s, amid hardship and scarcity, the American people adapted their habits, redefined their values, and developed a new kind of resilience that would come to define a generation.
The Depression era was a time of frugality. Every penny mattered. Families reused, repurposed, and repaired. Clothing was mended, not replaced. Food was stretched to feed more mouths. Recipes were simplified, meals planned carefully, and nothing went to waste. Utility and resourcefulness became everyday virtues. Even children were taught to contribute, helping in gardens, collecting scraps, or doing odd jobs for extra income. Despite these challenges, the 1930s were also a golden age of American entertainment. During some of the harshest years of the Depression, people still found solace in music, movies, radio, and literature. Entertainment became both an escape and a way of making sense of the world.
Hollywood flourished. While the luxury of going to the movies might seem extravagant in a time of widespread poverty, ticket prices were low, and theaters offered a few hours of warmth, wonder, and escape. Audiences flocked to see stars like Clark Gable, Shirley Temple, James Cagney, and Greta Garbo. Musicals, comedies, gangster films, and lavish epics dominated the silver screen. Studios adapted their output to the times, providing hope, distraction, and the promise of a better tomorrow. Frank Capra's films, like Mr. Deeds Goes to Town and It's a Wonderful Life, offered messages of decency, perseverance, and the triumph of the little guy. The movie screen became a mirror for the dreams of a struggling population. Radio was even more central to American life. Families gathered around their sets to listen to news broadcasts, serial dramas, comedies, and music. Programs like The Shadow, Amos and Andy, and Fibber McGee and Molly became staples. The radio was not only entertainment, it was connection, a thread tying the nation together with shared stories and sounds. And then there were Roosevelt's fireside chats. These informal radio addresses, broadcast straight from the White House, made the president's voice familiar in millions of homes. His calm tone and direct explanations of complex policies helped restore trust in government. In a time of great uncertainty, hearing the president speak plainly and empathetically brought a sense of comfort and clarity. Music too reflected the era. The blues and folk traditions captured the pain and endurance of working people. Woody Guthrie, with his guitar slung over his shoulder, travelled across the country, writing songs that chronicled the lives of the dispossessed. His anthem, "This Land is Your Land," would later become an enduring symbol of American unity and equality. Jazz continued to evolve. Big bands like those led by Duke Ellington, Benny Goodman, and Count Basie brought energy and sophistication to dance halls across the country. Despite segregation, Black musicians were defining much of America's musical identity, and some even broke into mainstream acceptance, though barriers remained high. Literature during the Great Depression often took on a raw, realist tone. Writers documented the hardships of everyday life with unflinching detail. John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath told the story of the Joad family, Dust Bowl refugees seeking dignity and survival in California. The book became an instant classic, capturing both the heartbreak and the hope of the era. Other authors, such as Richard Wright, chronicled the experiences of African Americans in the urban North, revealing the additional layers of oppression faced by marginalized communities. Wright's Native Son, published in 1940, was a stark and challenging novel that forced readers to confront the realities of race, poverty, and systemic injustice. Visual art, too, reflected the mood of the nation. Government programs like the WPA's Federal Art Project commissioned murals, sculptures, and public works from artists across the country. These works often depicted working-class life, industrial labor, and scenes of everyday resilience. The goal was not just to provide employment, but to elevate the dignity of ordinary people. In this same period, documentary photography reached new heights. Photographers like Dorothea Lange and Walker Evans captured the stark images of Depression life, migrant mothers, abandoned farms, and endless lines of the unemployed. Lange's photograph Migrant Mother remains one of the most iconic images in American history. A portrait of exhaustion, strength, and grace. Social institutions also evolved. Communities found new ways to care for one another. Neighborhoods created communal kitchens, shared childcare, and organized bartering systems. Churches played vital roles in delivering aid and maintaining morale. Local newspapers, while often struggling financially, helped keep communities informed and connected. Education was deeply affected. Many schools closed due to lack of funding, while others adapted by shortening school years or consolidating services. Still, education remained a deeply held value. Parents, even with limited means, encouraged their children to stay in school, hoping that education would provide a path out of poverty. Gender roles began to shift as well. While the traditional view was that men should be the breadwinners, the economic crisis forced many women to take jobs, often in domestic service, textile work, or clerical positions. Their contributions were often invisible or undervalued, but they were essential to family survival. At the same time, these shifts began laying the groundwork for later movements toward gender equality. Children of the Depression grew up quickly. Many left school to work. Others took care of younger siblings while their parents searched for employment. Their childhoods were marked by instability, but also by strong family ties and a deep appreciation for even the smallest comforts. They would carry the values of thrift, endurance, and modesty into adulthood, shaping the culture of post-war America. Religious institutions gained strength during this time, offering spiritual guidance and material aid. Sermons reminded congregants of resilience, moral strength, and divine purpose. Faith became both a refuge and a motivator, encouraging perseverance and community solidarity. Through all of this, a central theme persisted. Americans did not collapse in the face of hardship. They adapted, they adjusted, they endured. The Great Depression tested not only economic systems, but the national character. And in that test, many found depths of courage and creativity they didn't know they had. What emerged was a culture more grounded in reality, more aware of vulnerability, but also more attuned to the values of fairness, cooperation, and shared struggle. This cultural shift would continue to influence everything from politics to entertainment to social policy for decades to come. As we reach the end of this long and sobering journey through the Great Depression, we are left not only with an understanding of economic collapse and recovery, but with a profound sense of how history shapes identity, both personal and national. The Great Depression was not a single event. It was a process, a long unraveling of assumptions about prosperity, security, and the role of government. It stripped away illusions and laid bare the fragility of a system many had thought unshakable. Banks once seen as infallible crumbled. Industries thought too big to fail shut their doors. Families who had lived with stability found themselves relying on bread lines and soup kitchens. And yet, within that unraveling, something new was formed. The Depression fundamentally changed the relationship between the American people and their government. Before the 1930s, federal intervention in the economy was minimal. Welfare was a patchwork of local efforts, charity and self-help. After the Depression, a new consensus emerged that in times of crisis, it was not only acceptable but necessary for the government to act decisively to protect its citizens. This legacy lives on today in social security, unemployment insurance, minimum wage laws, and labour protections, many of which trace their origins directly to New Deal programs. It also lives on in the very idea that economic rights, the right to a job, to security in old age, to fair wages, are part of what it means to live in a modern democracy. But there are deeper legacies too, more personal, more intimate. The generation that came of age during the Great Depression carried its lessons for the rest of their lives. They were shaped by scarcity, forged by challenge. They became careful with money, resourceful in crisis, and loyal to their communities. They often held on to simple pleasures and avoided extravagance. They taught their children the value of hard work, the importance of savings, and the strength found in resilience. This generation, sometimes called the greatest generation, would go on to fight in World War II, to build post-war prosperity, and to navigate the challenges of a new global order. Their character was not formed in ease, but in struggle. For historians, the Great Depression is a case study in the consequences of economic inequality, regulatory failure, and the dangers of ignoring systemic vulnerabilities. It is also a testament to the power of democratic institutions to adapt and reform in the face of unprecedented adversity. It's important, too, to remember the unfinished business of the Depression. Not everyone was lifted equally. Racial and ethnic minorities faced discrimination in employment and housing. Women, while often taking on new roles, were still constrained by social norms and unequal pay. Many rural communities, particularly in the South and on native reservations, continued to live in deep poverty even after the worst of the crisis had passed. The New Deal offered a new vision, but it was not a perfect one. It laid the foundation for future reform, but also reflected the compromises and limitations of its time. In schools, textbooks still recount the stock market crash, the Dust Bowl, the New Deal alphabet agencies. But the heart of the story lies not in programs or presidents, but in the lives of ordinary people who faced extraordinary hardship and found ways to survive. It lies in the mother sewing patches into hand-me-down clothes, in the father walking miles in search of work, in the child studying by kerosene lamp because electricity was a luxury, in the neighbor who shared their last can of beans, in the dignity preserved even in the face of despair. The Great Depression reminds us of how interconnected our fates can be, how the decisions of bankers, lawmakers, and distant markets can reach into every household, how quickly security can become scarcity, and how essential it is to build systems that protect the vulnerable, promote fairness and plan not just for growth, but for stability. It also reminds us that recovery is possible, that leadership matters, that courage, creativity, and compassion can light the way out of darkness. And so, as the final pages of this chapter close, we are left with more than just a story of economic catastrophe. We are left with a portrait of endurance, a meditation on community, a record of how people, faced with the worst, found the strength to hope for the best. In whispers and stories passed down in faded photographs and trembling voices, the depression lives on, not to haunt us, but to teach us, not as a warning alone, but as a testament to what can be overcome. So rest now with the knowledge that even in the hardest of times, history shows us a path forward. Even when the night seems long, morning comes,